In 1940, Joe Louis was the most powerful athlete on the planet. Not just because he was heavyweight champion, but because he carried something heavier than a belt. He carried expectation. When he stepped into the ring and destroyed Max Schmeling, it wasn't just a sporting victory. It was political. It was psychological. It told millions of Americans, especially Black Americans, that strength, discipline, and excellence could not be negotiated away. But while Joe Louis knew how to dominate men with his fists, there was a battlefield he was never trained for. Paper, contracts, smiles that hid traps. Outside the ring, the rules were different. No referee, no rounds, no clear enemy. Just polished desks, friendly voices, and promises wrapped in fine print. In that world, power didn't come from punching harder. It came from who controlled the agreement, who owned the exit, and who understood the game well enough to never need to explain it. Joe Louis was about to step into that world without armor, believing that success automatically meant safety. It didn't. What stopped him wasn't a lawyer, a manager, or a warning label buried in a document. What stopped him was a man who understood power without needing permission to use it. A man who never signed contracts because he didn't need to. A man whose authority didn't come from paper, but from territory, reputation, and consequence. His name was Bumpy Johnson. This isn't a story about violence. It's a story about leverage, about how close Joe Louis came to losing everything without throwing a single punch, and why, sometimes, the most dangerous fights happen at a desk, not in a ring. By 1940, Joe Louis wasn't just winning fights. He was carrying an entire era on his shoulders. Every title defense reinforced the same belief: discipline beats chaos, preparation beats bravado. Inside the ring, nothing was left to chance. Every punch was rehearsed, every weakness studied, every opponent reduced to patterns Joe Louis could solve under pressure. That clarity, however, ended the moment the gloves came off. Outside the ring, Joe entered a system that had never been designed to protect men like him. Black champions were celebrated publicly and isolated privately. Money arrived in large bursts and disappeared just as quickly, siphoned by taxes, entourages, obligations, and advisors who spoke fluently about opportunity but never about risk. Financial literacy wasn't part of the training. Legal protection wasn't standard equipment. And trust, especially trust in men wearing expensive suits, was often the most dangerous instinct of all. Joe Louis didn't lack intelligence. He lacked insulation. Success had placed him at the center of attention while leaving him exposed on the edges. Promoters understood boxing. Managers understood schedules. But when it came to long-term security, contracts, investments, ownership, Joe was stepping into unfamiliar territory without a map. That gap between fame and protection was exactly where predators operated best. Not with threats, but with reassurance. Not with force, but with urgency. The irony was brutal. The man who could read an opponent's movement in a fraction of a second couldn't see the mechanics of a financial ambush unfolding slowly in front of him. And why would he? In the ring, danger announces itself. Outside it, danger arrives smiling, offering certainty, promising safety. Joe Louis believed that success entitled him to stability, that the system rewarding his victories would also safeguard his future. History shows the opposite was often true. This is the mistake that defined an entire generation of athletes and entertainers. They were allowed to earn, but rarely allowed to control. And once control slipped away, recovery became nearly impossible. Joe Louis was standing at the edge of that same cliff, moments from signing something that would quietly reroute his power into someone else's hands. The tragedy isn't that he almost fell. It's that the system was built expecting him to. The most effective traps don't look like traps. They look like progress. In the early 1940s, the men who targeted stars like Joe Louis rarely relied on intimidation. They relied on structure, on language that sounded professional, on documents that projected inevitability. This wasn't street crime. It was administrative control, and it worked because it felt legitimate. The pitch followed a familiar pattern. First came flattery. Your name has value. Your presence elevates the brand. Your future deserves protection. Then came urgency. Windows close. Opportunities move fast. Hesitation costs money. Finally, the illusion of ownership. Percentages, projections, partnerships. Everything designed to create momentum toward a signature before questions could form. The paper didn't need to threaten Joe Louis. It needed him to believe that saying yes was the responsible move. Entertainment venues were especially effective bait, particularly famous names like the Cotton Club. They symbolized glamour, permanence, and cultural influence. For a champion nearing the height of his earning power, the idea of transitioning from athlete to owner felt natural, even necessary. But the structure behind these offers was rarely what it claimed to be. Ownership existed on paper only. Control lived elsewhere. Profits were conditional. Losses were guaranteed. The danger wasn't a single clause, it was the architecture. Investment pools that shifted authority away from the investor. Performance benchmarks defined by the very people benefiting from failure. Exit penalties that punished doubt. Each component was defensible on its own. Together, they formed a corridor with no doors. Once inside, the only direction was forward, and forward led to dependency. What made this strategy so effective was that it targeted pride as much as money. Declining the offer meant admitting uncertainty. Asking for time meant risking exclusion. Bringing in an outside lawyer suggested distrust. The social pressure to appear sophisticated, decisive, and grateful did the rest. The trap closed not with force, but with consent. This is why contracts can be more dangerous than threats. A threat ends when the threatener leaves. A contract keeps working long after the room is empty. It shifts power quietly, legally, and permanently. For men like Joe Louis, who had been taught to face danger head-on, the real risk lay in something far subtler, agreeing to terms designed to make resistance impossible later. The paper didn't need to be cruel. It only needed to be final. To understand why the situation shifted the moment Bumpy Johnson became involved, you have to understand how Harlem actually functioned in 1940. On paper, it belonged to the city. In practice, it belonged to relationships, memory, and unspoken rules. Harlem was not a neutral space. It was a living system with its own hierarchy, and anyone who operated inside it without understanding that reality was already at a disadvantage. Bumpy Johnson didn't need a title to hold authority. His power didn't come from a business license or a legal document. It came from recognition. From the fact that everyone in Harlem, numbers runners, shop owners, musicians, politicians, and criminals alike, understood who ensured stability and who paid the price when that stability was threatened. He wasn't just enforcing control, he was enforcing boundaries. And one of those boundaries was simple. You don't exploit Harlem's symbols. Joe Louis wasn't viewed as a private individual in that neighborhood. He was communal property in the highest sense of the word. His victories weren't just his, they belonged to a generation that had been denied visible triumphs. That meant any attempt to quietly strip value from him wasn't just a financial move. It was an intrusion, a violation of territory. And territorial violations, even when dressed as business, were never treated as harmless misunderstandings. What made Bumpy dangerous in moments like this wasn't aggression. It was clarity. He didn't need to negotiate because, from his perspective, there was nothing to discuss. He understood the structure immediately. Outsiders attempting to convert symbolic capital into private leverage, using paperwork as a camouflage. He had seen it before, different faces, same mechanics. The details didn't matter. The intent did. This is where the logic of Harlem diverged completely from the logic of contracts. In the corporate world, legitimacy comes from signatures. In Harlem, legitimacy came from acceptance. You could have the cleanest paperwork in the world and still be completely unprotected. Authority wasn't granted by law, it was tolerated by the environment, and tolerance could be withdrawn instantly. Bumpy Johnson represented that withdrawal, not through violence but through presence. The moment he stepped into the situation, the balance shifted. The discussion was no longer about opportunity or percentages. It was about recognition of where they were, whose space they occupied, and whose rules applied. Harlem didn't need to explain itself. It only needed to be acknowledged. People misunderstand moments like this because they focus on the object instead of the message. The razor was never the point. Violence wasn't the strategy. In fact, force would have been the weakest option available. What mattered was certainty, the kind of certainty that ends negotiation before it begins. When power is absolute, it doesn't need to raise its voice. It doesn't need to explain. It simply establishes reality and waits for everyone else to adjust. What made the situation irreversible wasn't threat, but exposure. The structure of the deal had already been revealed for what it was, a one-way transfer of control. Once that truth was spoken aloud, the paperwork lost its magic. Contracts only work when both sides believe in the illusion that the system will protect them equally. The moment that belief collapses, signatures become meaningless. At that point, the only thing left is context, where you are, who you're facing, and how much protection you actually have. The razor represented consequence, not action. It was a reminder that the environment had rules older and stronger than anything typed on a page. Not rules enforced by courts, but by memory and reputation. Breaking those rules didn't lead to lawsuits. It led to erasure. Social, economic, and professional. No deals, no partners, no trust. In worlds built on informal networks, that kind of isolation is fatal. This is why no shouting was required, no countdown, no dramatic escalation. The outcome was decided the instant the balance of leverage became clear. The men across the desk understood something crucial all at once. Whatever protection they thought they had stopped at the edge of Harlem. Their connections didn't extend into this room. Their paperwork didn't translate here. And the cost of pretending otherwise would follow them far beyond this afternoon. Power, when properly positioned, doesn't need to be exercised to be effective. It only needs to be undeniable. The presence in that room transformed the situation from a business discussion into a mistake that needed to be corrected immediately. Not tomorrow. Not after a phone call. Now. The razor stayed clean because it never had to do its job. Its function was already complete the moment everyone understood what it symbolized. The end of the deal and the end of the conversation. What stayed with Joe Louis after that day wasn't fear. It was awareness. For the first time, he understood that danger didn't always announce itself as hostility. Sometimes it arrived framed as opportunity, dressed in respect, and delivered with a pen instead of a fist. The experience rewired how he evaluated promises, not by how impressive they sounded, but by who benefited if things went wrong. Joe Louis would still face financial struggles later in life. Taxes, mismanagement, and the long shadow that followed many athletes of his generation never fully disappeared. But there was a critical difference. He was never again placed in a position where walking away became impossible. He learned to slow the process down, to insist on time, to bring in voices that worked for him, not for the deal. Most importantly, he learned that hesitation wasn't weakness, it was leverage. That shift mattered because contracts are psychological weapons. They pressure people to commit before they're ready, to trust before they verify, to confuse confidence with competence. Saying no disrupts that mechanism. It forces the other side to reveal intent. Legitimate opportunities survive scrutiny. Traps don't. The moment resistance appears, false certainty collapses. What Joe Louis gained that afternoon wasn't protection for a single transaction. It was a framework, a way to separate visibility from control, fame from authority, money from freedom. He realized that being valuable didn't mean being safe, and that safety had to be constructed deliberately, not assumed. This is where the story moves beyond individuals. It becomes a lesson for anyone whose success attracts attention faster than it builds defense. Athletes, artists, entrepreneurs, all face the same imbalance at the start. They generate value long before they understand how value is captured. Those who survive learn one thing early. The most important clause in any agreement is the one that allows you to leave. Joe Louis walked away with his name intact, his money still his, and his future unwritten. That outcome didn't come from strength or luck. It came from recognizing, just in time, that power isn't proven by what you sign. It's proven by what you refuse to sign when the terms are wrong. What almost happened that day in Harlem wasn't a tragedy in the dramatic sense. No shots fired, no blood spilled, no headlines written, and that's exactly why it matters. Joe Louis came closer to losing his future at a desk than he ever did in the ring. Not because he was weak, but because the world outside competition rewards compliance more than courage. It doesn't test your strength, it tests your awareness. The difference between collapse and survival came down to one intervention. Not from an institution, not from a system designed to protect him, but from Bumpy Johnson, a man who understood something essential about power. When rules are written to exclude you, protection doesn't come from playing by them. It comes from knowing when they don't apply. Harlem didn't operate on paperwork alone. It operated on recognition, memory, and consequence. This story isn't about glorifying crime or intimidation. It's about understanding leverage. Joe Louis represented value. Bumpy Johnson represented control. When those two aligned, exploitation stopped immediately. Not negotiated, not delayed, ended. That alignment exposed a truth most people learn too late. Systems don't fail you by accident. They fail you by design, unless someone intervenes who isn't bound by their limits. Joe Louis went on to fight many more battles. Some he won, some he didn't. But he never again mistook access for security. He learned that the most dangerous losses don't come from opponents. You can see them. They come from agreements that quietly remove your ability to choose. Power doesn't announce itself with noise. Sometimes it walks into the room, changes the equation without raising its voice, and leaves without signing a thing. And when it does, the smartest move isn't to fight harder. It's to stand up, walk away, and keep what was always yours to control.